inspected the condition of both roads, finding some sections of edge drops and envelope pruning on Edo Chestnut Road. Pettifer's Road has since been graded a few weeks ago, and the recommendation is as listed above.
Thank you, Marsha. Any questions from the gallery on this item? No, I'll ask for a mover. Councillor Bussell to move. Councillor Benton to second that. Councillor Bussell, would you like to talk?
Yes, Mr Mayor. I've just got a question for Acting Director, Marsha McMonigal. The edges on the northern end of the Edo Chestnut Road on the sealed section, what's the plans there with the drop-offs?
So the drop-offs were picked up by the inspectors through their inspection program of the roads. Sorry. And they will be remediated in accordance with the RMP plan.
Thank you very much.
Marsha, just that RMP plan is the roadside management plan?
Road management plan, correct.
Thank you, so everyone's understand. Councillor Bussell, do you have anything further to add apart from asking a question? Microphone.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I'd just like to say the unsealed section of Pettifer's Road is in very, very good shape since it's been graded, and I'm sure that the locals will be very, very happy with the quality of that road. Thanks, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Any other councillor like to talk on the recommendation put forward? No, I'll put the recommendation to the vote. All those in favour? The recommendation is carried. Thank you, Marsha. 15.2, petition request for the upgrade of Church Lane, Millawa Northbound.
Yeah, so this was a petition in regards to seeking an upgrade or sealing of Church Lane at Millawa. In 2019, Council adopted a sealing prioritisation program. So within this report, it's actually listed where those road segments come on that sealing program, and it looks like that Church Lane is a significant way off. So the recommendation for this report, that Council instructs officers to respond to first signatory advising where Church Street is within the Council's road sealing prioritisation program.
Thank you, Marsha. Can I have a mover for that? Jack Carey, and a seconder, Councillor Fitzpatrick. Jack, would you like to talk on the recommendation?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Very much on the topic from the last item, the road management plan. That is a public document, and the petition submitters may very well be familiar with it. But I just wanted to say a few words about the scoring system, which is used to determine where roads sit on that priority list. We've got over 1,200 kilometres of unsealed road in the municipality, worth many, many millions of dollars of works. And that scoring system, which you'll find in the road management policy, allocates points depending on road usage. So it depends on what sort of road it is, whether it's an access or a link road, and it depends whether there's a school bus route on that road, a tourist destination, or other significant destinations such as a cemetery. So traffic is definitely a consideration, but it is in no way the preeminent consideration for determining priority of how we go about sealing roads. I can definitely sympathise with the submitters of the petition. Living on a small gravel access road myself, I would very much appreciate if it was sealed. However, it is also quite a fair way down that list, and I guess I'm just understanding of the fact there are numerous roads throughout the municipality that have a much greater need for sealing, and that's why this matrix and scoring system exists, which you can access in the road management plan.
Thanks, Jack. Any other councillors like to talk on this recommendation? No. We'll put the recommendation to the vote. All those in favour? Again, the recommendation is carried. Thank you. McCoy Street, sorry. The incorrect spelling of McCoy Street, El Dorado, 15.3. Please, Marsha.
So a request was received from a long-time resident in El Dorado, backed up by knowledge of his parents in their 90s and evidence documented by the family in the book El Dorado Gold. And the proposal is to rename McCoy Street, so MCCOY, to MCKOY, in recognition of Leo Baker McCoy, who ran the local bakery there. So the recommendation here is places the proposal to rename McCoy Street Eldorado to McCoy Street Eldorado on public exhibition, seeking submissions until close of business on Friday the 25th of June. Reports on any feedback will be received at the 27th of July council meeting. And if no objections to the name change are received, resolves to accept the name change and seek approval for the proposal through the Office of Geographic Names. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Marsha. Are there any questions from the gallery on the proposed name change? No. I'll put a mover for that, Councillor Benton and Councillor Grant. Councillor Benton, being of great history buff and in an age group that you may remember the change here, would you like to talk about the recommendation moving forward?
I'm pleased that you choose your words very wisely then. It's just to back it up that there will probably be some more changes too with the book and the history that seems to be becoming more prevalent in some of the people's minds nowadays, and getting things correct. It seems a rather detailed process we've got to go through with this, but that's the way the systems works with the emergency, the naming of it. So it's just what it is, Mr Mayor, and I think we'll go ahead.
Thank you. Any other councillor like to talk? Councillor Grant.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I only just want to perhaps comment on the fact that it points to the fact that how easily history can be rewritten. You know, there's a slip up somewhere along the line, and all of a sudden, things certainly look different. And while it will inconvenience some people, I'm trusting that the community sees the change for what it is, about correcting history, and hopefully we can move forward on that.
Thank you. Councillor Benton.
Just like to add, Mr Mayor, that I know the person that wrote Eldorado.
Just one moment. Because you were the mover, I want you to finish off with that, but I need to go one more person. Councillor Fuller.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Sorry, Mr Councillor Benton. I just wanted to acknowledge the work of our place naming committee, one of our volunteer groups that assists in this conversation. They do a little bit of the back end work to concur the history and to ensure we're on the right path. Thank you. Thanks,
Councillor Fuller. Councillor Benton to finish off as the mover.
I've got to rewrite where I was up to now, but I know...
Start from the start.
Firstly, the author of the Eldorado Gold, and they did an exceptional amount of work about over 10 years to do some credence into the relationship of the credibility of what's been put before you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll put the recommendation to a vote. All those in favour? The recommendation is carried. Thank you, Marsha, for stepping in for Director Goonan. Thank you. We'll go to 16.1 through Development Services. Stephen Swart, our Tourism and Events Program.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Council recently received 6 applications under our Tourism Event Funding Program. This round of funding is for events that will take place between July and December this year. And after completing an assessment process, Council officers are recommending that 5 of those applications be approved for funding, and those 5 are listed in the recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Swart. Are there any questions from the gallery on this recommendation? No. Can I have a mover? Councillor Bussell and Councillor Grant as a seconder. Councillor Bussell, would you like to talk on the recommendation?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to thank all the applicants, the whole 6 of them, the 5 that have been recommended. As the Councillor for Tourism, it gives me great pleasure to see this sort of activity. I also acknowledge there's a small amount of money left over from what we've recommended, and the year's not over yet, and there's many ebbs and turns with our COVID between now and the end of the year, and I think it's a great opportunity for the remainder to look at further events this year. So I think this is a great program for the rural city of Wangaratta. Thanks, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Any other councillor like to talk on the recommendation? Councillor Grant.
Yes, Mr Mayor, thank you. I'd obviously like to reiterate the comments by Councillor Bussell, but also to say how important this program is in supporting events, because I think events-based tourism is one of the cornerstones of our tourism here in Wangaratta, and I think if we're able to give businesses and events organisers a bit of a leg up, I think that's something that I'm very happy to see happen, and hopefully at the end of the day, bring more and more people to this particular part of the world, which we all agree is probably one of the nicest parts of Victoria.
Thank you, Councillor Grant. Councillor Fitzpatrick.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I think I'd just like to say in future, if there is people who are wanting to apply for grants and not sure how, please go and talk to our officers for assistance and support, because they'd be more than willing to help you. So if you have an idea, don't be shy and please apply. Thanks.
Thank you, Ash. Thank you. Councillor Buswell, did you want to finish as the mover, or are you happy to continue?
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I'd just like what Councillor Fitzpatrick has said is don't be shy and please apply. I think that's a good one. Thank you.
She's a poet. Thank you. I'll put the recommendation to the vote. All those in favour? The recommendation is carried. Thank you, Stephen Swart. Item 16.2 is a planning permit application, PIN application 20/240 for a development of 5 dwellings on Lot 20, Syracuse Circuit, Wangaratta.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. As you said, this item is about the planning permit application for multiple dwellings on the lot at 20 Syracuse Circuit, Wangaratta. Notice of the application was given as required by the Planning Environment Act, and out of that process, a total of 12 objections were received. The objections have been considered as detailed in the report, and the proposal has been assessed against the relevant provisions of the Planning Environment Act and the Wangaratta Planning Scheme, and the recommendation is to support the application subject to conditions.
Thank you. Any questions from the gallery? Yes, Barry. Just top up and again say your name.
Barry Thompson. With regard to that one and the next one you're going to talk about, I'm really worried about the parking and the bins being collected and other things in that area. And I think that there's nowhere near enough room. And I'd like to know how the council thinks they're going to be able to deal with that, so that all the people down in that area won't feel as if they're in danger of their kids getting knocked arse overhead by a truck backing out to get garbage or something. And it's very crammed down there, so I'm very interested to find out what the council's ideas are to make that work. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry, for the question. Stephen?
Thank you for that question. As part of the planning permit application process, the application was referred to our technical services department, and they helped us to consider some of those issues and other issues. In terms of bin collection, the feedback that we received is that there's enough space on the nature strips out there for bins to be placed and to be collected safely. And in terms of car parking, there's sufficient car parking provided on site to meet the requirements of the Wangaratta Planning Scheme. Plus, there's also space in the road reserve. This is the road reserve is slightly wider than other road reserves in similar residential areas, and there should be sufficient space for parking.
Thank you, Stephen. No further questions. I'll ask for a move. Sorry, Barry? Yep. Please give 2 questions per application.
With regard to that, Barry Thompson again, I just think that there's nowhere near enough room down there, and that whoever has worked that out, it's got rocks in their head because they haven't been down and had a proper look at it. The street's quite narrow. The frontage of that property and the other property that's going to be developed down there, there's nowhere near enough room. The car's not going to have enough room to park there, and I've had a look at the application in regard to the size of the buildings and the 2 and 3 bedroom units and all that sort of stuff down there. It's going to be a major dilemma down there, and I think the council needs to have a really long, hard think about how they're going to do that, because it'll only just end up going further and it's going to create a hassle for all of us. I'm not against development, don't get me wrong, but development in the right areas with the right blocks, with the right types of buildings and things like that is what we're looking at. And I just think you've got it wrong in this case, going on what you just told me. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry.
No question.
Thanks, Stephen. No question there, statement there, but answered in an add-on to the previous question. So can I have a mover of the recommendation? Councillor Grant, thank you. And a seconder, Councillor Herry. Councillor Grant, would you like to talk on the recommendation as the mover first?
Yes, I would. Now, this is an application that is in line with the council's planning scheme. It's an important development, and certainly in light of the city's accommodation crisis. The permit has detailed conditions, and I think in moving this recommendation, I would ask, however, that the council's planners, and we've already received that assurance that the permit conditions will be met, and this development will go ahead in the best possible way with the least impact on the residents that are already there. It offers alternative housing, and that's the way that we've got to look at the future in this municipality. Smaller, higher density, and which is not only in line with current population trends, but it's also in line with what people are expecting from housing. You know, people are wanting less space around them. They want, housing, and I think it addresses that. And I think we're in a position because of the fact that it falls in line with our planning scheme, that we do have an obligation to grant the permit, but I think we also have a very strong obligation to ensure that the conditions of the permit are actually enforced.
Councillor Grant, any other councillor like to talk on the recommendation before I do? Councillor Herry.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just to follow on from Councillor Grant's comments, I definitely recognise that the housing situation at the moment is dire in many rural areas, not just in Wangaratta. So the need for smaller houses and more diverse house stock is clearly evident, and by providing that diverse house stock, we're potentially going to enable a diverse demographic to have low maintenance, affordable housing. We are in a situation where, as Councillor Grant said, the planners have checked this against the Wangaratta planning scheme, and it does satisfy those requirements, and there are permit conditions going on to the planning applications. I don't want to discount your concerns, Barry, that you raised in the question around parking and bins, and just how big the street is and how many cars are going to fit there. However, I do think we are jumping ahead and putting the cart before the horse in a way in anticipating who and what sort of use these units are going to receive and who's going to live in them. They may be people who don't necessarily have an excessive amount of cars. There is one car park per unit and two for visitors. And then, of course, overflow will go onto the street naturally, as it does in any street. But another point with respect to the bins is that this planning application is situated on a corner or opposite a corner, and there will be a reasonable amount of nature strip of nature strip on the opposite side of the corner that won't have cars or where cars shouldn't be parked. So just there are potential spots for bin collection, is the point I'm making there. So I think to round it off, the diversity of housing stock and satisfying the strategic direction of the Wangaratta planning scheme to push for greater choice is ultimately an important consideration. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Any other councillors like to talk on this recommendation? Okay, so I'll talk on it. Sorry? Councillor Benton,
Yeah.
sorry.
I've agonised over this, Mr Mayor, in both ways, and I know on planning it's very hard to knock this back, but I am concerned of the issues that were brought up here. I live in a court in Wangaratta, and I can visualise some of the things that are being brought up, and I know that's not in planning. And I think we have an issue as a local government area that these things that are outside the planning but are going to be an integral part within the living in that area are going to have to be addressed a little bit more than, yes, we're going to have to enforce them. It worries me going forward with this, that how are we going to manage it, because I have a very narrow frontage myself, and if I'm just visualised the other day how if we had 5 cars outside the place, where would they park? Because I can't get a car parked in front of my place. I know it's not a planning rule, so how do we handle it going forward to make sure that the amenities and the other thing that's troubled me since I come back into the council, there's been a great push to make sure that this town remains a rural, safe town. I've heard that many, many times. The reason that people have come back out, and previous councillors have even said they come back to Wangaratta because it's a rural, safe town to bring their children up. I'm still tossing up, quite frankly, which way to go with it. I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Councillor Benton. Just make sure there's no one else before I talk. Okay. There is a way to handle it, as per your last question. The way to handle it is to refuse the application. I believe it's an overuse of an allotment in an area. We're certainly saying, I agree, everything with Irene Grant, Councillor Grant says, and Councillor Herry, that we need diverse living arrangements in Wangaratta, and absolutely perfect, and in that area. There's no problems there. It's not that, this is the wrong allotment for that. It has no street frontage. It's got a 13-metre street frontage. By the time the driveway is widened to secure ingress and egress out of the property, there is no room for bins. There is no room for cars to park out the front of their own properties. If it was done over a 40 or 50 metre frontage in that street, it would certainly make things easier, and cars would be parked out the front of their property, of the property of those units. I'm probably the biggest developer and pro-developer in this room and in Wangaratta, and I'm the one who's requesting council to knock it back. I've never knocked back a development. I'm knocking it back. I'm not knocking back. It's a great development, 5, 6 units, whatever these 2 applications are. It's a good thing for Wangaratta, I agree, just not that location, right on that mouth of that. Can you see why the developer is doing it now when all the houses are built and all the land sold? If he did it at the start, would people have sold those blocks at those prices around those areas? Probably not. He's had years to build them since that development's being done. He's left it to the end when he's already sold all the other allotments around him. So I don't think that's fair. If it was turned into 2 or 3 bedroom, 2 or 3 units on each block, I could live with that. The development then will have more parking on site, double garages, etc. on those units. But having 5, or in the next application 6 units on a tiny 13-metre opening, putting bins out the front of other people's properties on nature strips, it's allowed, it is. There's no problems with that. It's a loss of the amenity of the area. It's just not kosher what we do in a residential area in Wangaratta. There's not a lot of properties that people put their bins, and it's not 2 bins, that would probably be all right, or 4 bins. It's 12 bins every week. It's a lot of bins. We talk about the planning scheme, it fits into the rules of the planning scheme. Yes, it does. So does a brothel in Wangaratta if it was to be applied for in an area that fits in with the planning scheme. Do you think Wangaratta people would love it and approve it and say, would you be here at council saying, yes, let's approve that brothel? We'd all be sitting here saying, no, but hang on, it applies to the planning scheme. It fits in with the planning scheme. There's nothing against it apart from residents who don't like it in their area or in their town. We'd probably knock it back. This is a great development, just not in this area or not in this location at that, with the driveway frontage of only 12 or 13 metres on both these properties. I'd hate to get in history's time and say we council overdeveloped that street with those 11 units in one little area within 100 metres of each other, not 2 kilometres of each other, within 100 metres of each other, with cars coming in and out. They're units that will be for men, their partners, females and their husbands, whoever it is. They've all got 2 cars. 2-bedroom units will have 2 cars. 90% of them will. So with my history in real estate, they don't usually rent to one person with 1 car. Then friends come over. and they're parking on the streets, and the neighbours, and I know what it's going to be, our compliance officers will be saying, someone's parked over half the front of my driveway in 2 houses up the road or 4 houses up the road. There's 20 cars having a function, whatever the case may be. So in I'd urge us councillors to look seriously at it and refusing, and talk to the developer about putting in a reapplication of something a little bit more usable in that area. Again, I reiterate, the developer's had a long time to build these units. He's left it until every block of land has been sold or built on before he's decided to develop it. He wouldn't have developed it, and he wouldn't have sold the land around at the same prices, knowing that you're building next to 6 units or 5 units. Loss of the amenity. It's a big thing. Thank you. I'll refer back to Councillor Bustle, and the mover was Councillor Bustle? Sorry? Sorry, Irene, it was you. Did you want to finish off there, Irene? Councillor Grant?
Original comments with regard to that it is in line with the planning scheme. I've asked the planners to ensure that the permit conditions are met. I think it's difficult to legislate to how a development might pan out in a social sense, but I think that's where we have a role as a council to ensure that bins are picked up in an acceptable way, that parking is conducted in a reasonable way. I know in one street in Wangaratta where the parking was changed in Johnson Lane because of the fact that people were parking on both sides of the street, and so therefore, you know, that did change, and it's made it easier for the residents. So there are things that we can do as council to ensure that this is enacted in a more appropriate way. But it still comes back to the fact that we need accommodation, we need a diversity, as Councillor Harry said, diversity of accommodation in our community, and it fits in with the strategic direction of where our community is going. We've got to be pretty much all things to all people in terms of what accommodation offer is available here in the rural city of Wangaratta. So that is...
Thanks, Councillor Grant. So I'll put the recommendation to a vote. All those in favour? 1, 2, 3, 4. All those against? 1, 2, 3. No, I'm not voting. I know. No, not at the moment, but you can bring up a comment in business at the end of the council meeting. So I've gathered 4 people in favour of the vote there, with Councillor Grant, Councillor Herry, Councillor Bustle and Councillor Fuller. And against is Councillor Benton, Councillor Fitzpatrick and Councillor Rees. Thank you.
Point of order, Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
Were you calling a division there?
I wasn't. I was just confirming up the vote, but thanks for asking. There was no division. We know what the vote is. I can call a division. Did you want to call a division, Councillor?
Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, we'll put the vote again. Can we register those votes? Can all those in favour please put their hand? You know, in a division you can change your mind. I'll take that as Councillor Grant, Councillor Herry, Councillor Fuller and Councillor Bustle, and all those against. Councillor Benton, Councillor Fitzpatrick and Councillor Rees. Thank you. The recommendation is carried. Stephen Swart, sorry, Director Swart, could you move on to the next one, which is 16.3, Planning Permit Application 20/241, Development of 6 dwellings on a lot at 36 Syracuse Circuit, 100 metres up the road from number 20. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As you pointed out there, this is a similar application in the same road, just up the road. It's for 6 dwellings as opposed to 5. It's a slightly bigger lot, but it's got similar characteristics in the sense that it's got a narrow road frontage and then extends wider to the back. Notice of the application was given, and as a result of that, 9 objections was received in this instance. Council officers have considered the objections as detailed in the report. We've also considered the proposal against the provisions of the Planning Environment Act and the Wangaratta Planning Scheme, and recommend support of the application subject to conditions.
Would anybody like to talk? Anne Dunstan, thank you. First.
Anne Dunstan in Tarawinji. your recommendation is incorrect because it says a 5 dwellings at 36, but 6. From a professional perspective, looking at this as a body corporate manager, both these applications are very difficult to work and manage. I see the job of the future body corporate manager to be very difficult in the respect that there will be a lot of management, and if you don't have good owners or good tenants, the movement of traffic will be a nightmare. There is a small solution to rubbish bins. In the waste management policy, you can negotiate with a body corporate to reduce the number of bins on site, but that will be up to the manager and owners at the time, so that could reduce the number of bins that go to the curb. But if I ever had an opportunity to comment before something was built, I would request that there would be more space and more visitor car parking.
Thank you. I'll take the question as, Stephen, that is there room for any further car parking or space on that allotment? Oh, I made it into a question.
It's very difficult to answer because there's certain things that have to be changed on these plans. One of the conditions on the recommended permit is for them to submit new plans to make a few changes. One of those changes could potentially provide a little bit more room. Whether it's enough for additional car parking, it's difficult to say at this stage. I will just say about car parking that in every instance, the previous application and this application, the proposal is to provide more car parking than the planning scheme actually requires. So in this instance, they are providing 8 on-site spaces, so 8 spaces on-site. So we're not talking about on-street parking here, and 2 of those are for visitors. The requirement in the planning scheme was for 7, so they've exceeded that standard.
Thank you. Mr. Fox, did you have a question?
Yes, sir.
Just one moment. Did you need to spray that, Benny?
I would love to. I was actually going to just wait to see if you wanted to.
Sorry. Thanks, Anne.
Think this is bad? You should see it during the rock show.
Thanks, Mr. Fox. Could you please stand up, state your name again, and ask your question?
Brian Fox from Wangaratta. Mr. Mayor, you'll have to be a little tolerant with me rather than asking a question. I believe there's 2 simple solutions to this sort of problem, and it's happening all over Wangaratta, not just out in the west side. It's happening all over. We have changed from 1 car to 1 bedroom relatively. And now we have 2 cars per bedroom. I'm suggesting that if you park your car in a residential street, you devise some way of writing the number that you are, of the resident you are visiting on the car. Now, whether you take a texture and write it on the window or whether you get a sticky note, doesn't matter. But now we have it anonymously. You can go and park your car down the street and annoy that guy, and he doesn't know whose car it is, he's guessing. So I'm saying you should have to identify the residents you are actually visiting. My second point is that most of our relatives come from England, and they all had a front lawn. And we came over here and we had a front lawn, and we all played drafts and hockey on the front lawn. Now everybody watches the TV. The only time they walk on the lawn is when they mow it. And I'm suggesting to you that somehow within the planning scheme we get rid of the front lawns and turn them into car parks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. No question there, Stephen, but I'll make one out of it. Can we change the planning scheme to put parking on the front lawns, or it's a massive job changing anything in the planning scheme, as you and I talk about a lot?
I think, Mr. Mayor, that's out of the question. That's not in relation to the debate here. You only made a statement.
Oh, it's making that statement.
Point of order.
All right. Thank you, Councillor Benton, for making that point of order. We'll leave that for a private matter. Okay. If there's no other questions from the gallery, I'll ask for a mover, Councillor Herry, and a seconder. Oh, sorry. Yes, councillor Herry will make that recommendation shortly, a change to that recommendation. And a seconder, sorry? Councillor Grant? Right. Right, that's true. They're seconding the 5, so I'll go back to a seconder. So, councillor Herry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I'd like to move the recommendation, move the motion as per the recommendation with the following amendment, that where it reads 5 dwellings, it instead reads 6 dwellings.
Councillor Grant, are you happy to second that it does read incorrectly and to fix the anomaly there? Thank you. Councillor Herry, would you like to talk on the recommendation?
Briefly, Mr. Mayor, thank you. I do appreciate your input, professional input, Anne, and the management of cars is definitely a concern at the fore of my mind. I think in a way it brings up a larger issue, which is the way our cities are structured for car use. Obviously, that's not something that you can change overnight. However, it's definitely coming out as a theme, which is why I think it's always important that we think about how we can move away from car-dominant movement and integrate active transport so that cars in general and car parking may become less of a hot topic. But I think many of the comments with respect to the need for diverse housing and increased density on the last item would carry over to this one. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Herry. Would anybody else like to talk then? Councillor Fitzpatrick, please.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I think that majority of our community members would be for development, affordable housing, having diverse individuals, which is what we want. We don't know what individuals are going into these housing lots. It's just not the right block. I have a great-grandmother who has, units with the space for visitors, and it is painful. Even as a visitor, when you're visiting, they've got their 2 car ports, and then you've got 2 spaces. It's very, very challenging. It's just not the right spot. That's just my opinion. But I do want to comment to you, Mr. Fox, about having people's names on cars. I don't agree with that due to privacy and confidentiality reasons. And with stalking, family domestic violence, I don't want people to know whose names are on whose cars for all different reasons. Thank you.
None of the units, thank you. Anybody else like to talk on the recommendation? Councillor Bussell and Councillor Fuller then.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. As a rural councillor and listening to objectors, and I think these are not the issues that I normally confront in the rural sector. Nevertheless, they're all very serious considerations in making these decisions. What sort of a city do we want? Do we want a tall one? Do we want a sprawled out one? Do we want everybody to have a 1 block or acre block? And my view is we need all of those things. And I've listened to the Mayor say that the tenants might have many friends and many cars. But the opposing view is that they could in fact be friendless and they could be carless and they could eat not much, so they don't generate much waste. So they're all considerations to be taken into effect here. And I certainly want to see Wangaratta move forward. And so those are all the considerations that I have to take into consideration. And I can't say no to this motion either. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Fuller.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd just like to echo the social change that Councillor Herry touched on in terms of advocating for people to use less wastage and to actually reduce the bins, as mentioned in the waste services poly by Anne, in that sense, but also to challenge the way that we actually build, and in the future, as Councillor Buster indicated, what do we want to see, and more bike paths and public transport advocation and things like that that actually change the way that we actually commute and move our way around, that does reduce the impact that we have in terms of car usage. We've recently seen stats that show it's one of the biggest indicators of carbon emissions in our municipality. So working towards, as a group socially, and our submissions are open until Friday, 5 p.m. For the budget, the plan and the vision. So people out there listening can contribute these conversations via those channels. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fuller. No other councillors like to talk before Councillor Green?
I'll just give my support to Councillor Herry and his moving of the motion to reiterate my feelings about the low maintenance, the affordable housing, the diversity, the strategic direction of the municipality. It's difficult, and I know Anne mentioned before about managers and tenants. No planning scheme can make provision or even predict what sort of people are going to live in the houses. We just have to hope that we've set up a system around the development. You can go to any part of Wangaratta and you can find shortcomings in the way things have been developed. And again, it is up to council to ensure that, if there are shortcomings, that we actually work to reduce that and to make the town a better place to live for everybody. And whether you're a little old lady on your wheelie or you've got, 2 cars or whatever, that, our community reflects the diverse nature of the people that live there. And I see that this is, it's not a perfect, but it's in line with our planning scheme. And we've got a responsibility to ensure that we make the most of it, and we ensure that the permit conditions are met to make sure that it will be the development that is being proposed.
Thanks, Councillor Graham. I'll just reiterate a few other things that I mentioned there before. I will ask a question of Director Swart. Director, we often have a lot of community groups that put input into certain situations because of their professional and diverse range of backgrounds to get their opinions. Do you feel we should have a situation, e.g. Anne Dunstan, who's a body corporate manager, he handles large, small, medium-sized groups of units. Should we have a corporate entity or an advisory panel or committee on people to look at these developments to give their advice, e.g. someone like Anne who manages and handles these things? And I bet you a lot of her inquiry and her heartache comes from larger developments because of an overuse of an allotment, or in this situation, it's not overuse of a 1,700 square allotment. Well, I'm not complaining about that. It's the overuse of a 13-metre wide frontage to that allotment for 6 units. That's the overuse. And I imagine Mr Thompson talking about the fact he's not anti a 6-unit allotment size. Is that the best location for it? No, because of its frontage. Should we be able to use someone like an Anne Dunstan to get her advice that comes through planning? It's not a planning requirement. It's not a statutory authority like a North East Water or North East Catchment or anything. Should we be able to use a body like we do with Wangaratta Economic Development and Tourism Committee to get thoughts?
So, Mr Mayor, I think in terms of what council wants to do in terms of how council decides planning permit applications and make other decisions, that's probably a matter for council to discuss. I think in terms of the planning application process, I'll just stick to that for the moment. It is very clear how we should treat planning permit applications. The Planning and Environment Act tells us how we should treat those applications, how we should process those, which steps we should take, when we should advertise them, which authorities we should refer those applications to, how we should consider that information, and within which time frame we need to complete all of that in. So that's not something that council has discretion in. We have to follow those processes. In terms of completing additional tasks as part of that process, they may not have any statutory weight. If we did do that, They may add time frame to the process as well, which could mean that we aren't going to meet our statutory obligations, and there's some risks involved there for council.
Thank you.
I will also add that in terms of the planning scheme, it contains very specific provisions when it comes to these types of developments. Not just very strong policy support from a state point of view and a regional point of view, but also very strong local policy support, so Wangaratta policy support. The planning scheme also includes particular provisions that apply to these types of developments, which is generally called res code, and that is shown in the documentation provided to council today. It shows a very detailed assessment of the application against res code. All of the objectives of res code are met by these developments. That code or that particular provision is standard across the state, and that's not something that council puts in place. That's been put in place by state government and achieves consistent outcomes across the state.
Thank you. So I'll just reiterate the fact again, the frontage is the problem. I'm not saying, I think we're looking at the wrong way. I believe in multi-unit developments, 5 or 6 on a 1,700 square metre block is appropriate, just not in this location because of its narrow frontage. Again, if it was over 3 allotments, it would be a perfect development size. People could park out the front, bins out the front of their own house. The ingress and egress would be a lot easier and better. And in my professional opinion too, as the mayor and as a real estate agent. But I'll put now back to Councillor Herry. Did you want to finish off, Councillor Herry, or you've had enough as the mover?
I'll say a couple of extra words. Thank you, Mayor Rees. Just regarding the Wangaratta planning scheme has been called into this conversation quite a bit, sort of as a bit of a fall and as if it's pushing us down this path, which in many ways it is, with its strategic direction that encourages infill, encourages striving for increased density and active transport and sustainability concepts. I just thought I might introduce that subject a little bit because affordability is one aspect of the current, one aspect that's people are struggling with in the current housing market, and obviously these sorts of developments, which as Director Swart indicated there is a lot of support for in not just the local Wangaratta planning scheme, but at the higher levels of planning as well. These sorts of developments are sustainable and provide an opportunity for people to live in smaller houses with less carbon footprint. But that concept of affordable housing, it doesn't just come in when you're renting a house and when you're purchasing a house, it also comes into the ongoing running costs of a house. So I note that in the planning application there are a few measures to try to reduce the running costs, including double glazing on some of the western and north walls and some shading and orientation. But I really do encourage the applicant and anybody building a house to really give serious consideration into the ongoing affordability of living in that house, be it yourself or be it somebody else who's renting that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. In that case, I'll put the recommendation and the motion to a vote. All those in favour of approving? 1, 2, 3, 4. All those against? 1, 2, 3. We've got that. So we had Councillor Grant, Councillor Herry, Councillor Bussell and Councillor Fuller in approval. I'm just making note of this. And against, Councillor Benton, Councillor Fitzpatrick and Councillor Rees. Thank you. We'll move on to the next topic. 16.4, C83 update and amendment to proceed. Not to proceed, please, Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As you point out there, this item is about Planning Scheme Amendment C83 or Proposed Planning Scheme Amendment C83. In March last year, Council resolved to proceed with the preparation of Planning Scheme Amendment C83 to make some minor changes to the Wangaratta Planning Scheme, and that includes updates and technical corrections. The items listed for inclusion in that amendment is included in Attachment 1, and they have differing requirements to be fulfilled before they can be included into a planning scheme amendment, and each of those requirements also have differing timelines. To try and progress the items listed in a timely manner, officers are proposing to not proceed with planning scheme amendment C83, but to include those different changes in other planning scheme amendments that we are already working on.
Thank you, Director Swart. Any questions from the gallery on this item? No. Can I have a mover, please? Councillor Benton. Seconder, Councillor Fitzpatrick. Any councillor like to talk on the recommendation? No. Councillor Benton.
I'd just like to point out, Mr Mayor, we've just done 2 items in relationship to amenities of a block. And some of the information embedded in this report is around about the size of a block. And they're coming down to 300 metres, and I'm only going to foreshadow. I thank the opportunities for us to do a little bit more thinking about what those sizes and where they're going to, how we can handle them, of the discussion that I've just listened to over 2 applications. Thank you.
Thank you. No other conversations, thank you. I'll put the recommendation to the vote. All those in favour? The recommendation is carried. We'll move down to item number 19.1, which is a record of assembly, advisory committee, Brendan McGrath.
Thanks, Mayor. Just one set of advisory committee meeting minutes, and those are from the Economic Development and Tourism Advisory Committee from April, and they are here for Council's noting.
Thank you. If there's no questions from the gallery on this recommendation, can I have a mover? Councillor Fitzpatrick, Councillor Grant. Any councillor like to talk on the recommendation? We'll put the recommendation to the vote. All those in favour? And the recommendation is carried. There's no urgent business, but I'll now say to public question time, there is only allowed 2 questions from every person who in the gallery if they want to make a question or ask a question. I do have one question from a lady which I will read first. Either that can be written or it can be asked at the microphone. And I will state it is question time and not statement time, so it needs to be a question. The question I have is from a lady by the name of Jenny Ashby. Dear Mayor and Councillors, on page 61 of the Council agenda papers for the 25th of May 2021, you provide measures and targets for the Council Plan Report 2020 to 2021. EO4 value of infrastructure per head of municipal population, the graph provides year-to-date 2021 targets of $18,000. We request Wangaratta Council to take a deep dive into the data to identify what is rural versus CBD, that is Wangaratta Township breakdown for this data. 2/3 of the rural city of Wangaratta population live in Wangaratta and 1/3 live in the rural areas. Based on the population estimate for the rural city of Wangaratta, as of the 30th of June 2020, that is $29,197, rural areas should currently be enjoying approximately $175,182,000 in value of infrastructure. But do we? Particularly if most of the infrastructure is located in Wangaratta Township. The council draft budget shows a spend of $4.712 million for 21-22 for roads. What part of the expected spend will be in the rural part of the Wangaratta local government area? We at Whitlands are keen to know if the infrastructure spend is equitable based on population. Do rural areas get their fair share? And thirdly, do rural communities get their equitable share? And can you please allocate some funding to sealing the remaining 7 kilometres of the Benalla-Whitfield Road? Thank you. Brendan McGrath, could you indulge us, please?
Thanks, Mayor. So thanks, Jenny, for your question and for the work you do out in the valley there. So there's a couple of categories of questions here, I think. One is around whether rural areas get their equitable share of our assets, and the other are a couple of specific questions relating to next year's proposed budgets. On the assets themselves, I'm not really in favour of making arbitrary splits around, who assets are for and whether it's equal or not. Many of the assets we build are for everyone's enjoyment. If you look at places like the Performing Arts Centre and the library here in Wangaratta, they're clearly not just for the benefit of urban residents, they're for everybody. equally, there are plenty of people from Wangaratta go out to sporting grounds and tennis courts all over the rural areas on a weekly basis to play sports there. So I don't actually think there's much benefit in trying to attribute an asset to a place. In terms of the capital works spend questions themselves, next year's proposed budgets has around about a quarter of the works would be considered by us to be for the whole municipality. About 37% of the work would be for the urban area or in the urban area, and around 39% would be works carried out in the rural areas. So I think when you look at next year's CapEx budget, the rural areas are getting far more than the 1/3 share that Jenny refers to. Her specific question about road spend, there's around about $4.7 million of road works proposed next year in the capital works budget, and around 3.8 million of that 4.7 is work that will be carried out in the rural areas. So again, a far greater proportion than the 1/3 share that Jenny refers to. Her final question is around 7 kilometres of road sealing on the Benalla-Whitfield Road. It's well recognised by us. We've, as a council, been actively meeting with a range of federal and state members over recent months and putting forward some of our priorities. And the Benalla-Whitfield Road is one of about 6 of our top priorities that we've been talking to all of those state and federal members about. So we're certainly pushing hard at both state and federal level for some funding for what we think is a very important road project.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, Jenny, for the question. To the gallery now. There's no other questions that have come in from writing, so we'll go to the gallery. John. Again, John, just state your full name.
John Griffiths from Wirraley. My question is about priority pedestrian crossings, and I don't quite agree with Councillor Benton in this regard, because the 2 main roads or streets busiest in Wangaratta, that's Murphy Street and Reed Street, do not have priority pedestrian crossings at all. It's an absolute problem trying to get across both of those streets at the areas where there is some provision, but there's not a priority for pedestrians. So my question is, I believe that there are plans, and I'm quite surprised at this over the years, that Vic Roads have actually approved, must be about the first one, a crossing in Reed Street, and I believe it's been approved, but the council hasn't moved. They may have funding put aside, I don't know. I just wonder what the status of that particular crossing plan
Certainly. We're strong advocates for it, so I might throw that to you, Brendan. Is that all right?
Thanks, John, for the question, and you are right. We had been working over a long period of time with Regional Roads Victoria on a priority pedestrian crossing in Reed Street. We initially had budget to do that as part of the broader pedestrian crossings that you have seen done in recent times. There was a bit of disagreement about the precise location of that pedestrian crossing and the impact it would have either on Maloney's Lane and or the removal of a significant number of car parks, depending on where it was located. We decided to go and do a further round of consultation, primarily with business owners around Reed Street. And while all of that was going on and while we were negotiating approvals with Vic Roads, which we obviously got, we moved that budget money out of the budget and used it for other purposes while we were working through that. So we now have the location agreed, which is fairly close to Maloney's Lane, and we have approval from Regional Roads Victoria to do that work, and it now needs to be re-budgeted as a priority to get that work completed, which I don't think it is currently in next year's budget, but it is one that we do need to look at funding for now that we've got all that sorted.
Did that answer your question there, John?
Yeah, that's good.
Great. Did you have another question?
Yeah, I do have a second question. I have carefully prepared a second question. It's actually just brought to mind following on from a letter which was in the Chronicle yesterday, and it's an issue about the bike paths along some of the main roads, not the rail trails, but the other cycle paths. And there's concern about the attitude, the road rage attitude of, well, how to describe it, drivers who've got really no idea what's going on in terms of safety of cyclists going along the snow road. I ride a lot. I personally wouldn't ride along the snow road itself for my safety. I'm an older person, so perhaps not as quick and agile on the bike. But I know the cycle path very well through Oxley-Millewa, and I think Diane's comment was, well, there's the section in Millewa is really quite rough because of tree roots have pushed up the cycle path. I don't know how you solve that one, but that's up to the planners to work that one out to make it safer. But that is an issue, and that's partly why cyclists will go down the snow road itself, and because it's not safer, but it's easier to ride, it's smoother. So my question is, how do you convince Nonghead road rage drivers to have some more tolerance for cyclists who are only trying to get a safe ride, not on a rough surface like you get through Millewa?
Okay, thanks, John. Firstly, I'll put a CRMS in through Rebecca to have a look at that part of the cycle path between Oxley and Miller to make sure that we can hopefully iron out a few problems where it is a bit rougher, which will then go to infrastructure services there with Marsha's department, not through Stephen, but happy to see you out there with a shovel fixing it, Stephen. So we'll certainly look at how to convince drivers. It's how long's a piece of string? I don't know what you could possibly do apart from maybe signage. It's a Vic Roads road going through there to say, drivers, please take care of cyclists or look out for cyclists, just to make them more aware. They're the only avenues that I could possibly think, unless, Marsha, you had some further thoughts being in infrastructure.
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Signage and awareness and education and things like that probably would help a lot. And I noticed Vic Roads have actually dropped the speed and made it quite prominent going into Oxley as well, which would help. But certainly your recommendation, Mr Mayor.
Correct. Thank you. Councillor Grant.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. John, I don't know whether you're aware that there's a group in Wangaratta, a bicycle user group that are very active in raising awareness for bicycle safety, you know, keeping a metre apart and all this sort of thing. My husband too is a cyclist, and he often talks about people who drive very aggressively, almost, you know, to show cyclists a thing or two about being on the roads. It is about education, it's about making people aware, and I think we all have a role in that, all of us in the community, in the way we drive and the way we, behave around cyclists. And it's an ongoing process, and I think one that certainly won't be solved overnight, but I think if we work on it together as a community, I hope we can get some success in that.
Thank you. Jack?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a concern. It's a larger cultural issue in a way. I ride a bike, I drive a car, and sometimes I walk. so I'm a cyclist or a driver or a pedestrian. But really, I'm just somebody who uses different modes of transport. And I think the more that we can do to encourage diverse use of transport, both between our townships but also within the urban municipality, will just help to break down some of those competition barriers or that sense of an us first, them approach to it. When really it should just be seen as different people getting around on different modalities of transport at different times. Yeah.
Thanks, Jack. John, are you all right to leave your phone number with Rebecca so she can maybe pinpoint a few more areas of those of that cycling path from Oxley to Miller to make sure we can get our guys to have a bit more of a closer look at it?
Yeah, sure. I'll just comment, I am on the, what do you call it, it's a group chaired by Monica Helena, and I am consulted on different steps that have been taken. There's
with the bicycle
mention of
industry.
about 5 or 6 recent projects that have been done. So I'm involved in
Involved.
that
Okay.
work.
Thanks, John. Thanks for your questions. And just leave with your number with Rebecca. She probably already has it there at the table behind you. It's Rebecca. Thank you, and she'll make a CRMS and we'll get contacted that way. Are there any other further questions from the gallery? Mr. Fox and then Ann Dunstan.
I want to refer to this piece of paper, and I've got a very shaky hand. If you mind putting that microphone down to there, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. So you sit, by all means.
I thank you for the courtesy. Mr. Mayor, as you're probably aware, I've got a raft of 100 questions because I haven't had the opportunity for a little while. However,
That question alone, Mr. Fox, is your first, and you had plenty of opportunities by email, of which I've received about 100.
there's not quite the same emotion in an email or a letter. But anyway, we won't go into that. Mr. Mayor, there are some things that are urgent and some things that are important. And what I want to put to you today is something that is both urgent and important. And I'm talking about Vic Rail and the proposed works that they are doing and propose to do through the middle of our town. I want councillors to be very much aware that this spend by Vic Rail will be the very last spend we'll see in any of our lifetimes. And so we must make absolutely sure that we get the best deal possible from that government authority. There will be no second dipping. I strongly advise that this council hires a contract negotiator, come arbitrator, to negotiate on our behalf with Vic Rail. I have no doubt that Vic Rail will want to talk about engineering difficulties and cost. I'm not interested in that. It behoves the elected representatives of the people to talk about infrastructure convenience or, on the flip side, inconvenience to the 25,000 people of the RCO, of the rural city of Wangaratta, related to their personal options and needs. From our side of perspective, we would like the Templeton Street crossing reopened, as it was the Vic Rail that closed it in the first place when the standard gauge line came through. The soon-to-be abandoned standard gauge railway line running through the viaduct was excavated by Vic Rail.
Point of order, Mr. Mayor.
I'm sorry.
Yes,
Mr.
point of
Mayor,
order.
What's the question?
Mr. Mayor, I started out by saying this is urgent and important. If this councillor comes from Edai and he's not concerned about the traffic getting from the west side of town into the bakeries in Reed Street, well, I ask him, would he mind holding his peace till I'm finished?
Mr. Fox, it's at my discretion to override. Now, we do need to get to a question rather than a statement here, and my councillors, fellow councillors, will support that decision. This is public question time. You can certainly mention everything in your prologue via an email to all our councillors. Should have done that prior to on notice and then ask the question. Your question is, I'm imagining, would we advocate to ARTC, so Australian Rail Transport Corporation, to advocate to reopen the Templeton Street bypass or pass? Is that your question?
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, but I haven't finished my question.
I'm helping you finish it, Mr. Fox. Is that going to be your question at the end of this?
Yeah.
Would we look at that?
Plus some more things on the end of that.
More questions on the end of that.
I'm not taking up any more of your time than the two previous respondents.
Mr. Fox, just one moment there. I conduct the meeting. I will give you a little bit more leniency, as in a minute more. But until the questions come out, we can't answer statements. This is a statement. Again, ARTC land is not our land. We can't tell them. We negotiate with them and try and talk to them, and we will do that on people's behalves.
Mr. Mayor, I don't want to get into the discussion about the difficulties or the cost, the engineering. I don't want to get into that. I want to get into how are the people who are building a house in the new estates actually going to get to the corner of Murphy and Reed Street. When I came up here this evening, I got to the Green Street roundabout. I reckon there were 25 cars all the way back to Edward Street.
It's great. I love seeing it, Mr. Fox. It's a vibrant city in which we live. Things have changed since the 1980s. We live in a big city. We are progressing. We are getting busier. Go to Melbourne, the same thing will take you 35 minutes. So that is progression. And we are looking at ways of making that traffic flow without having to open up a traffic bypass through Templeton Street. But if that's one of your advocations towards speeding up traffic, it's a great suggestion. We'll put it to them. Now, is there a further question from here?
As part of the question, we have been given two options for pedestrians, both of which, in my view, are impractical. I neither want to walk up a hill to cross 50 metres of railway line, nor walk down the other side. I neither want to walk down a hill under a tunnel or walk up the other side to cross 50 metres of railway line. I don't want to do that. The best option, of course, is to replicate the Sisley Avenue Railway pedestrian crossing.
Point of order, Brian, you've asked this question in this forum and previously via email. We've already responded. There is no way that we're allowed to do that. We've answered that question via Brendan and by Dean. There is not allowance made by anyone in the Vic Rail Corporation or the ARTC for a pedestrian crossing in that manner. We've already answered this question.
They will never
email.
go back. You've asked it. It's been answered. They will never go back from having an underpass or an overpass to going back to having a level road crossing. It will not happen. It's been asked and answered 20 times. So move on to the next question.
I'd like to know who have told you that it won't happen. Vic Rail?
All of them. ARTC, Vic Road, our infrastructure services, Victorian government. Dan Andrews said we will never go back. If there's an overpass now, we will never go back to level crossing. Your indication with that with Docker Street, I spoke to you about Docker Street. You mentioned it to me. I spoke to Vic Rail. They said they will never go back to having level crossings. So anything that doesn't have a level crossing now and has got that ingress or egress through to the street will never go back to having level crossing with boom gates or gates.
Mr. Mayor, I say to you unashamedly that the people that are making this decision live in Toorak or Kew or Footscray or somewhere where railway crossings are a problem.
Correct.
We live in Wangaratta. We are different cattle.
I suggest you go and talk to your local member, Tim McCurdy, who visits those people that make that decision on ARTC. Tim McCurdy is your vestibule to get to the government leaders that make those decisions, not us here at council. We cannot change that law even if we agreed with you. We will never get that opportunity to change. But Tim McCurdy is your man. I've got his number. Do you want it?
I
Right.
know where he lives. No, I won't say this. Mr. Mayor,
Point of order, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Fox has had two questions.
Which a councillor has pointed out.
I'll give you one question, Mr. Fox. Get to the answer. Get to the question so I can get to the answer and get you back in your seat.
Well, the real crux is, will you employ an arbitrator, come councillor, whatever, to sit between Vic Rail and me?
Yes, we've got two of them. One of them is Brendan McGrath and the second is Dean Rees. We are the arbitrators. We pay Brendan a massive amount of money to do this and he's very good at it.
I tell you, sir, what happens when you want to build a road or a gutter or whatever? You hire a consultant. Well, how about if you hire a consultant for this important thing? As I say to you, it's urgent, it's important, and it needs to be operated by a councillor. If you think that you and Brendan McGrath are the epitome of negotiators, well, Why do we have real estate agents, and you're one of them?
I am one of them. I'm a
They talk
negotiator.
between the customer and the seller.
And that's what I will do. I will talk between ARTC. I've got people like Marsha McMonigal on our team as well, and Infrastructure Director Goonan, who are experts in this field as well, on what we can get. We want the best outcome for Wangaratta, and we will fight and argue to get the best outcome for Wangaratta.
I'm saying, sir, that
Not for Brian Fox. If you're in that outcome, that's great. It's for Wangaratta.
I'm saying, sir, you're not going the right way about it, and that's my view.
Thank you, Mr Fox. That's the end of your question. Now you may take a seat. Thank you. Ben, I'll get you to spray that microphone and ask Ann Dunstan to... You've still got a question, Ann? Thank you.
Have I got time for a second question?
You've had about 3 there, 4 there. But more than happy for you to catch up with Councillor Bussell after the meeting tonight, because you seem to have misplaced his email address, as he keeps telling me. Ann Dunstan, welcome to the microphone.
Thank you. In December 2020, the minutes changed and public question time became referring to the YouTube timeage. As someone that lives in a very poor service area and has terrible internet service, to not only download the minutes from the website and then have to go and click on a YouTube link to see what public question time was is a very challenging thing to do. So I'm wondering if we could change it back to having actual written public question time with people's comments, etc. Because in future, if we, and I have had the opportunity to look through the archives downstairs and look at minutes, etc. of meetings, YouTube may not exist in the future, so it would be great to still have it hard copied into the minutes, if possible.
Brendan, thoughts on that? Achievable? Definitely.
I hadn't given it much thought prior to Anne's question, but it's a reasonable question. I think it's likely we could come to a bit of a middle ground. I don't anticipate we would ever want to go to try and keep a verbatim record of the sort of discussion we've just had. For example, we're not set up to scribe Hansard. But I think we could provide a bit of a summary of the question and the answer as part of our minutes without too much difficulty.
Thanks, Anne. Nothing further? Any further questions from the gallery? You've had your 2 questions, but I thank you, Mr Fox. Ladies and gentlemen, in that case, 4. That's right. And you've only had 2.
I'm very careful to have my 2 carefully prepared questions.
Thanks, John.
I'm very aggravated about Mr Fox rambling on and not bothering about a question.
Thank you, John. Read your comments. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll now call the meeting to an end. Thank you very much for your attendance. To our members of the gallery, thank you. Thank you for your questions. And have a good afternoon. Enjoy your night with your families.